students were upset. We got these police officers here who were threatening in their posture, who took out their billy clubs as if they were going to beat us.
At that point, I didn't know where to go after this, what to do.
I said, we got to run for our lives, so we got to running. I slid down the balcony and went out the back. I didn't want to get hit with a billy club.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
I'm very pleased to be joined today by Simone Drake, Hazel C. Youngberg Trustees Distinguished Professor at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. She is a faculty affiliate at the Moritz College of Law, the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, the Department of African American and African Studies, and the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Welcome to Voices, Dr. Drake.
Thank you for having me.
And I should also add welcome back, because I interviewed you at least a couple of years ago, I think, and we were talking about legal studies. You were moonlighting as a legal scholar.
Yes, and I still am.
So today we're here to discuss the documentary film that you executive produced called Shutdown. And I think before we get started, maybe we play just a bit here of the trailer for the documentary.
Sure.
There was one day when we had representatives of the Black Panthers standing on one side of one street in front of the school, and on the other side we had the American Legion, of all people.
The police had come in numbers and were up in the community to come into the school. We had no knowledge of this.
A number of the students were upset. We got these police officers here who were threatening in their posture, who took out their billy clubs as if they were going to beat us.
At that point, I didn't know where to go after this, what to do.
I said, we got to run for our lives, so we got to running. I slid down the balcony and went out the back. I didn't want to get hit with a billy club.
So tell us what Shutdown is about.
So Shutdown is about a series of events that happened in 1971 at Linden-McKinley High School here in Columbus, Ohio. The tensions were building. There were racial tensions that were building as the Linden neighborhood started to experience some pretty drastic racial demographic shifts from majority white and, in a matter of just a few years, majority black.
It did happen really quickly, didn't it? Or as quick as any sort of sociological phenomenon would.
It did. My parents both are graduates of Linden-McKinley, and I think in 1968, when I look at my aunt's yearbook, my dad's sister, it's majority white. And by the time I look at the 1973 yearbook from my mother, it's majority black. And so those tensions were felt starting with a Black History performance at Linden-McKinley. I think it was the first ever, and there was a big disruption during that event. And as we moved into the spring, by May, just erupted into the police raiding the school and assaulting really anyone and everyone at the school. And a lot of the tension also was around a group of black students who wanted black studies at the school. They wanted more black teachers, and they wanted to be able to fly the black nationalist flag, which ultimately really seemed to be kind of straw that broke the camel's back in a sense, with things just falling apart by the end of May.
There's a lot there. Let's start with that group of black student leaders, a black student union, I believe they were called.
Yes, they called themselves the Black Student Union. Eventually, you would have many black student unions all over the country and throughout secondary and post-secondary schools. So, yes, the Black Student Union was a kind of student-formed group that really kind of wanted to self-educate. They would meet at different locations, but primarily at one of the members' uncle's basement, who he lived with, John Wells, and educate themselves on what they felt they weren't getting in the curriculum at school, but also on real kind of racial and social class inequities. So they talked about also going and visiting Upper Arlington High School and seeing that they had this facility that was much better and they had a swimming pool. And so it was a rather kind of multi-tiered sort of way in which they were thinking about what it meant to be Black students then, the Black experience in the United States, but also kind of on this granular level as well, just even within their educational institution.
And the leadership of that Black Student Union, I believe you've interviewed all of them. Am I understanding that correctly?
I cannot say if we got every single one of them or not. I do know that we got the primary, we got the primary leaders. Unfortunately, the two of the most prominent leaders passed before the film came out.
In 2021, I think I saw. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yes, unfortunately, I mean, this was kind of grassroots in a sense, but my father, he graduated in 72, so he wasn't the class of 71, but he was there as a junior when this all happened, and he used his contacts to basically get people to be involved in this.
It's a really compelling story. The film begins with sort of talking about the sociology, I guess, of the neighborhood. I mean, it really nicely sets up the situation in Linden and in Columbus, I think. Give us a little more sense of what was happening in the neighborhood.
I also grew up in this neighborhood. I grew up in South Linden. And so the neighborhood did have a dividing line, which they talk about in the film, which was Hudson Street. And it was predominantly Black south of Hudson, so in South Linden, and then predominantly white in North Linden. There was that division of the neighborhood, but, you know, everybody went to the same high school. This is also a time period of a lot of uprising and turmoil in the United States. In the mid-60s, 64, you start having like racial uprisings across the country, particularly in northern cities and on the West Coast. We didn't have anything that elaborate in Columbus. Those tensions were there. In the late 60s, you had the National Guard at Ohio State's campus. The year before, Kent State, you had students killed, and also lesser known at Jackson State at the beginning of 1971. So just all around, there were social issues and political kind of strife. The students definitely were aware of that. They could feel it in Linden. You also had the rise of the Black Power movement and their awareness of that, even though generally I think, especially then, if people thought about Ohio, they were not thinking about Columbus, perhaps Cleveland.
Cleveland, maybe,
yes.
Sure.
Cleveland had a Black mayor, and it took a while before Columbus became on any radar, and I think we just had a different industry, different pattern of migration and things like that. So.
But no less consequential. You mentioned, and it's sort of a critical part in the middle of the film, where there's a performance during Black History Week, and there's I'll let you describe it, there's a disruption.
Yes, there is a disruption, and the students were so excited about doing this. They had hired some teachers from Central State University, HBCU, here in Ohio, to teach African American history. And they did this performance. One of the teachers wrote the skit, the plays, and Linden-McKinley's auditorium has a balcony.
And it's a play of the history of Africa from slavery to the present. It was sort of the story of Africans in America, yes?
Yes. And so a group of white students, one who everyone identified by name.
But it's not in the film, I noticed.
Yes. Initially it was. And I was watching the final edits. I I don't think that we can say his name
and
or show his face.
Yeah, you shadow his face, yes.
But it seems that most everyone that we interviewed did know who it was. They had some flyers they threw over the balcony and showered down onto the auditorium. What's interesting is, we're doing these interviews. We're doing this during, we started these in 2020 during the pandemic. So that was all very interesting too. But we're doing these interviews and we keep hearing about this event. And everybody has a different memory of what the flyer said. Everybody says it was something racist because apparently students did take off after them when they threw them, but they weren't sure what it said. And amazingly, my father ended up finding out that there was a teacher who had saved the flyer.
Because it's shown in the film.
What is shown in the film is the actual just photocopy of the flyer that this teacher had saved. The teacher had saved all kinds of things. And so the teacher had the flyer.
And it does say some pretty racist things. It's pretty obvious what the intent is.
Yes, very white supremacist propaganda.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, that ruined the event. It became the marker of when that school year became disrupted.
One of the people you interview, one of the black students, said, "I never knew they felt that way," in reference to the white students. That was her takeaway from this moment. It was a really poignant moment, I think, in the film.
And I think one thing that we learn later is that individual perhaps didn't necessarily even feel that way himself.
Yeah.
Dr. Jean Harris and her husband, they see him not too long later at a restaurant, and he apologizes and said that he was influenced by his parents' politics.
Yeah.
And that's not really, I guess, sentiments he wanted to share anymore.
Yeah, and that's Jean Harris, one of the student leaders and then later superintendent of schools for Columbus City Schools.
Yes, yep. She became the superintendent of Columbus City Schools and retired from the school district.
There's another event about the time or shortly thereafter. Students lead a march that ends up in Franklin Park. Say a little more about this,
yes.
Again, really important moment.
That march is something that I knew about as a child.
That's so.
I didn't know this story at all, like the violent part of the story. I didn't know that. I just know that in my mother's yearbook, which I loved to look at as a child, I think I always loved archival things. And also I thought that they had funny hair and things like that. So I would look at her yearbook all the time, and there must have been photographs that they were marching. And I knew that where I lived in South Linden and where Franklin Park was a long walk.
Yeah. So they marched down Cleveland Avenue and then up Broad. That was a march.
Yeah, I knew we only went to Franklin Park in a car. And so there's something fascinating to me about that. My dad had retired and was taking a screenwriting class at the African Studies Community Extension Center and needed to write a script. And somehow when he asked me for my help, I said something about, what about the march to Franklin Park? And then I actually learned there was this, it wasn't as romantic as I thought. I mean, it kind of was. That day actually was a good day for students. They were excited about it. Almost all of the black students marched from Linden-McKinley High School to Franklin Park. And what's interesting is, you got to hear all these different stories. And then sometimes people didn't know the backstory. So they knew they did this march. But then I found out that the first director of Black Studies at Ohio State University, Charles Ross, had organized what was basically a birthday party for Malcolm X, who at this point had been assassinated. But it was a birthday party in Franklin Park for Malcolm X. Alex Haley was invited and spoke. A local minister who was very active in the local civil rights was there. And there was music, lots of Congo drumming and things like that. But they did kind of like a Marcus Garvey style parade through the neighborhood that looped around to Long Street and back to Broad. And then they marched back to Linden-McKinley from there. And so, everybody thought it was a great event. That's not really how the local news reported it. Their focus was a lot on how everyone was supposed to be welcome, but a local, I think like a white Ohio State student showed up and he was like assaulted or something, and they reported on that for a couple days. But the students just remember it being, just peaceful and, of an event that made them feel good. And we got lucky to get original photographs from that.
And they're presented in the film, and it's really quite striking to see this. And to be clear, this is done during school hours. So the report is the school is emptied at least of black students.
Yeah,
and I think
the white students might have gone home. In 1971, when I looked through the news archive, so Linden was having its issues, but it was not the only school. There were a number of junior high schools and high schools where Malcolm X's birthday was actually a pretty popular thing that students wanted to be able to celebrate. They just wanted different things connected with civil rights. And so while Linden shut down and could not reopen, there were other schools that periodically, like at lunch hour, the principal would just say, everybody go home. I'm like, really? There was a lot of this going on in 1971 of students walking out of school, of administrators not being able to contain an issue and just saying, leave, or if people want to leave, they can leave. So it was beyond Linden, but no place experienced what Linden ended up experiencing.
And then tell us about, this is not tied to the March to Franklin Park. There was, I'll let you describe it. Police in riot gear attacked students in the school.
Yes. So, after coming back from a community kind of meeting at a church, the students decide to put the Black nationalist flag on the roof of the school. And it's taken down pretty quickly.
Students wanted to replace the American flag with
Yes.
the Black nationalist flag,
Yes. The flag gets put up. They call a meeting in the school auditorium. There was a lot of this going on as well in 71 at different schools with students calling administration into the auditorium. So they call for a meeting in the auditorium, and the flags are put up in the auditorium. And it seems that the next thing students know, the school is being raided by battalions of police in what looks like riot gear, and they began assaulting students, teachers, administrators. The janitor is one of the photos that the press had was of their janitor being arrested. And my dad was like, yeah, he was trying to protect the kids. He's trying to protect us. And the school shuts down. They try to reopen repeatedly, and it's determined it's not going to be possible. And so what they ended up having to do so that the seniors can graduate is allow them to, I think it's about a week later or more, come back just to sit for their exams. But then during that period, it's occupied by police, and one of them ends up assaulting Mr. Brown, one of the assistant principals.
Who is African-American, I
Yes.
believe. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was one of two. The other one...
I thought he was the only one.
I did too, but I think there was one other one. I think that there were two, but the other one just wasn't entering into the stories that we were getting, so we didn't contact him. But yes, Mr. Brown and many of the teachers were quite young in their careers. Mm-hmm. Some of the teachers were just fresh out of college. They weren't that much older than the
I thought he was a student at first when he first started interviewing him.
Yeah. Also, aside from Mr. Brown being arrested, there were two teachers that came to his aid, two white teachers who were arrested. And Charles Ross was arrested on the day that the school actually closed because he happened to be there with another OSU professor, Dr. Kelsey. It was covered for weeks and weeks in the media, his trial.
And what's extraordinary, and I had to keep reminding myself as I'm watching this, is that this is all happening in 1971. Everything we've been talking about, this is all in the year 1971.
And all in the first 6 months.
Yeah. So what happens after 1971? What happens after all of these events?
Well, in 1971 in the fall, what happens is they just treat it as if nothing happened. Now, if something like this happened, there would be counseling for children. There'd be all kinds of things, but they just acted as if it had not happened. Teachers were reassigned. Mr. Brown was reassigned. And the people that returned back to Linden, there was really no addressing what happened. But I think there were other things going on. There ends up being a legal case, Goss v. Lopez, a class action, about students basically being suspended or removed from school without due process. And in that case, they don't base it on race, on racial discrimination. They base it on due process, not getting a hearing. But when I read the syllabus of the case, I'm like, okay, Malcolm X, these different, and like, these are black students.
Yeah.
Even though it didn't say that. And so that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I see what was going on at Linden as being very much, even though I don't think any of the students that were plaintiffs were Linden students. I see Linden being right in the center of that whirlwind of that happening. And then by 79, we have court-mandated school integration in Columbus, Ohio, which is quite late.
Yeah.
Quite late. But Pennock versus the Columbus School Board, that also went to the United States Supreme Court. So it wasn't until 79 when they finally implemented the desegregation decree, which is also 1 year before I started kindergarten. So, in just one decade, I think it's actually pretty significant that there were two education-based U.S. Supreme Court cases that were right here in Columbus, Ohio. I wouldn't call them landmark Supreme Court cases, but they went to the United States Supreme Court. Pennock, the judge here, was the first black judge. There was a lot of drama around how they were going to do the integration and what schools might need to close in order to do it. North High School was targeted, and people were very upset about that, partly because I think North was actually one of the more integrated high schools, and so there was controversy around that. But I think one thing that came out of it that personally affected me is Columbus Alternative High School was Dr. Ilg. He was the kind of first principal founder. He came up with this idea to kind of basically do this sort of voluntary integration really through this high school. And it was very, very 70-ish, very unstructured and non-traditional. And it
sounds wonderful.
It was. And many years, later, when I ended up going there for high school, it really was wonderful and non-traditional. I don't know how much attention it gets now, but when I was still in high school, nationally, it would get attention for its strong academics, but also just a kind of alternative approach.
Why did you decide to produce this film? Where did the idea come from?
I had never really thought about producing a film. I write books.
I was going to ask you that too. Why a film as opposed to, I don't know, article or typical thing that an academic is supposed to do?
Well, I did end up writing a couple of little short pieces on it, but I wanted them to be able to tell their stories, for one thing. I mean, it wasn't my story to tell. Film gives that voice. It was only supposed to be a documentary short, and it really, the idea kind of came when the director, Celia Peters, was teaching the screenwriting class that my dad was taking. And when he started to have to actually write the story, and I started hearing all of these other parts to it and what actually happened, I was like, that would actually make a good film, a good documentary. Mm-hmm. And so I had some funding that was for community engagement. And so I'm like, okay, we can give this a try, 15-minute documentary short. and this is, I think, about 2 weeks before everything shut down because of the pandemic in 2020, in March of 2020. And when we got people together and decided, maybe we can make this happen, and we were ready to go to the studio, it was kind of the same week where everything shut down, and we had to wait until, I think, August with very, very stringent COVID precautions. By that point, Celia had moved to Oakland, and, we really couldn't be on campus, and so we were on Zoom.
Yeah, there's a couple of them on Zoom, I noticed, yes.
Well, even when they were here in this studio, Celia and me and Alan Coleman, another producer, we would be on Zoom. They'd set up an iPad for us to be on Zoom to talk and do the interview. So, even in that way, it had its challenges, and that's part of it. It took a little longer to get out. We were hoping to get it out for the 50th anniversary, which would have been 2021, and it didn't until 2 more years later. In 2023.
Well, it's not 15 minutes, it's an hour, and it's very, very much worth watching. It's just a terrific documentary. I learned a great deal from this, and we're going to have a link to it on our website, and I would urge everyone to watch it. Simone Drake, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.